Thank you all for joining today's webinar. This is the second session in a three-part series. My name is Jacob White. I am joining you from Ohio University, where I work for the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs. My background is in chemistry, and past career, I served as a science educator and developed a passion for engaging in support for the K-12 STEM community. In an effort to help Ohio University reestablish the Southeast hub of the Ohio STEM Learning Network, I have put together 3 one-hour webinars, pulling together content and resources from past professional development sessions that I've offered, focusing on inquiry-based teaching. This series is effectively a pedagogy primer on inquiry-based teaching strategies. We held a session approximately a month ago, which focused on the concept of science inquiry, what it means, how it is conceptualized in terms of a teaching philosophy. Mackenzie is going to share a link in the chat to a recording of this first webinar series. We understand some of you could not attend the first session, and that's fine. I have attempted to structure these sessions as standalone offerings, so it's fine if you cannot attend each of the 3 sessions. We encourage you to if you have the availability. If not, we will be providing recordings to each of the 3 sessions and making those available. Today's session is going to be an extension of that focus. I am going to share examples of subtle, small changes in lesson plans that have been incorporated with the intention of promoting student inquiry. This is the second of a 3-part series, and a third session will be offered in March, approximately 1 month from today, which will serve more as a working session in which you'll have the opportunity to collaborate with peers to creatively apply your own subtle shifts in lesson plans in an effort to promote more student inquiry. Today's agenda, just quickly, I will provide a review of the main concepts from session 1, conceptual framework for understanding science inquiry, and how we should consider teaching through science within this framework. I'm going to spend most of my time today sharing with you lesson plans, examples of various versions of lesson plans that have subtle changes or subtle shifts that have intended to promote student inquiry. We will look at versions of the lesson plan without these changes, and then we'll look at versions of the lesson plans with these changes. They are subtle, yet very targeted and effective in promoting increased student inquiry. In doing so, I also want to share a very simple reflection tool that can be used for gauging student inquiry within a science lesson. This is a very practical tool and can be utilized to gauge relative degrees of student inquiry within a lesson plan. And as Mackenzie said, I'm going to end and try to allow for a bit more time today for questions, answers, comments from attendees, hopefully providing a platform for you to collaborate with your peers. I am not sure if I will be able to address all of the questions. We have about 40 participants joining us today. Depending on how many questions there are, I may not be able to address all of them, but I want to say at the start of today's session, I welcome offline correspondence. Please feel free to reach out to me with questions, comments, needs, successes in applying these concepts in your classroom. I enjoy that correspondence with science teachers. So if I'm unable, or even if I can address your questions here today, please don't hesitate to take me up on the offer for offline correspondence. And with that, I want to begin with the first of 3 interactive polling questions. Some of you may not have been able to join the first session, And so to gauge your level of expertise regarding science inquiry, I'm going to ask that you please respond to the following shared poll. Please share with us which of the following best describes your experience level with inquiry-based teaching strategies. This gives me just a general understanding of the attendees' level with science inquiry. I can tailor some of my comments and shared resources surrounding the level of experience you have with teaching through inquiry. Okay, I'll give you just a moment. I see about 80% of participants have responded so far. Just a few more seconds, if you would, please. Okay, I'm going to shut down the poll and just share the results quickly so you see of the attendees today. We have a majority of the attendees answered moderate experience. So your experience levels with teaching through inquiry or quite broad. I would say a normal distribution or Gaussian distribution centered around moderate experience. Thank you for sharing that poll with us today. And I would ask you to please respond. In just a moment, I have two other simple interactive polling questions I'm going to ask. Your responses are anonymous to the polling questions. A quick review from session 1, and I would encourage you, if you were not able to join us for session 1, to access the recording of the webinar that Mackenzie shared in the chat, in which we focused on the concept of scientific inquiry, what that means, and how we can understand scientific inquiry as a teaching practice. When we consider science as a process, scientific inquiry refers to the act of actually doing science, the process skills of doing science. There are a few important components to that. Many of us associate this with the scientific method and the steps within the scientific method. Asking questions, planning and conducting experiments, analyzing data to draw conclusions, and communicating results to others. Now, I have condensed the process skills of science into these 4 categories for the sake of today's webinar. We can expand on these, articulate them to more grade level differentiated skills. But for today, I'm going to frame the process skills around these 4 general concepts. Scientific inquiry is the process of doing science. As a teaching philosophy, if we ask ourselves, how do students learn these process skills? My philosophy is very consistent with the work of Carol Dweck out of Stanford University, who championed the growth mindset model. I believe students develop the ability to do science by practicing. And as educators, I feel it is important, if we intend on promoting student development of these process skills, our teaching strategies are intentionally designed to give students practice in doing science, practice asking questions, practice planning and conducting experiments, practice analyzing data to draw conclusions, and practice communicating their results to others. These process skills are expected learning standards within the state science curriculum. The Ohio Department of Education has articulated these process skills in the front matter of the learning standards, framed in the context of both science and engineering practices. These emanate from the work of the National Research Council. And if anyone is interested, Mackenzie is going to post a link to the state standards in the chat. Again, the science and engineering practices are referenced in the front matter. At each grade level, these process skills are further articulated. And I want to bring to your attention the state science standards have now incorporated a new section referred to as the nature of science. The nature of science includes science inquiry. These expectations are articulated in the standards relative to each grade level. So if you reference the science standards and access your own grade level content statements and expectations, there will be a nature of science section that includes expectations for science inquiry. If we ask ourselves then, what is teaching through inquiry? Any strategy that is intended to give students the opportunity to practice these process skills is a teaching strategy through inquiry. Giving students the opportunity to practice any one, two, or all of these process skills is teaching through inquiry. In many discussions I've had with teachers and my own reflection on my own science lessons as an educator, I've asked myself, is my curriculum inquiry-based? Are my science lessons inquiry-based? Am I teaching through inquiry? Early in my career, I had a misconception as to what it means to teach science through inquiry, what this pedagogical strategy really means. My misconception was that teaching through inquiry was dichotomous. I had the assumption that strategies were either inquiry-based or not inquiry-based, nothing in between, dichotomous. Either they were inquiry-based or not inquiry-based. I came across a framework developed by the Mallinson Institute for Science Education, housed at Western Michigan University, that really addressed that as a misconception I held. I shared this framework in session 1. This is a framework that really presents science inquiry in a different manner. It was a benefit to my teaching practices, and in providing or overviewing this framework to teachers in the past, I've received positive feedback and felt that it was worth sharing through this webinar series. I'm going to give just a quick overview, and again, encourage anyone who was not able to join us for the first session to access the recording. And I welcome your offline correspondence if you have questions or comments you'd like to share. This framework demonstrates that inquiry-based instruction should not be conceptualized as being dichotomous. Instead, any given science lesson should be understood as having a degree of student inquiry spanning across a continuum of varying levels of students applying the process skills of inquiry. On one end, there is no student inquiry within a lesson plan. That's on one extreme. On the other extreme, a lesson plan may have full or complete student inquiry, students applying all of those process skills as a responsibility at the student level. This framework, though, stresses that there's everything in between, and what exists in between can be very beneficial in informing our practices as educators. This can be visualized as an inquiry spectrum, and the researchers at Western Michigan University have presented categories of varying levels of inquiry. On one extreme, there's didactic direct instruction, in which a teacher presents and explains science content directly, perhaps offering illustrations or demonstrations or examples, but there are no student activities. Students are passive recipients of direct instruction provided by the teacher. There are modes of instruction that can be categorized as active direct, in which a teacher presents and explains science content directly, illustrating with examples or demonstrations. But this form of instruction includes student activities. The students are doing something, they are actively involved, but they are exclusively following instructions. They are doing what they are told. This mode of instruction is referred to as active direct. A mode of science instruction that involves more student application of the process skills of science is termed guided inquiry. This mode of instruction involves students actively exploring phenomenon or some science content idea, with the teacher providing guidance towards desired content but the students have an increased degree of responsibility for applying those process skills, one or more of the process skills. And on the far end of this spectrum in the conceptual framework, the researchers from Western Michigan describe full inquiry as open. On this end of the spectrum, open inquiry would be a mode of instruction in which students actively explore phenomenon or ideas as they choose. The teacher is present and facilitates the process, but does not prescribe or dictate the activities or the outcomes. In session one, I shared what were called classroom vignettes, in which there were different variations of the same lesson plan falling into each of these four categories. And the intention was to demonstrate that lesson plans can span a wide variety of levels of student inquiry. Students are not either participating in no inquiry or participating in full inquiry. They could be participating in an infinite spectrum of varying levels of process skills. I ended the session with this suggestion. A significant portion of the science curriculum in the K-12 system should encompass the active or guided inquiry components. If you feel that your science curriculum is almost exclusively falling at the didactic direct category, it is likely that your students are not given enough opportunity to practice the inquiry skills such that they would develop the ability to actually do science. That's a quick overview from session one. Again, there's a link in the chat to a recording of that webinar, and I would encourage anyone who was not able to join us or anyone who was able to join us but would like to review or get a refresher to access that recording. Today, I want to overview a professional development workshop that was developed by the Exploratorium Institute for Inquiry, which is housed in San Francisco. Mackenzie is going to post a link in the chat to this specific facilitator guide. This guide includes all of the resources I'm going to share in the remainder of today's session. And it can be used to guide discussions with science departments. If any of you have an interest in what's shared today, I would encourage you to access this facilitator's guide and consider sharing this with your colleagues. This would be an excellent activity to share within a science department meeting, a building leadership team meeting, or even at the district level. This workshop is referred to as Subtle Shifts, Adapting Activities for Inquiry, and I'm going to begin with the take-home messages, just to stress the main ideas. To help learners develop the abilities to do science as a process of inquiry, teachers need to give students responsibility for using those process skills. They need to practice them. That practice is likely to result in developing the skills. Teachers can make small shifts in their current lesson plans to help learners strengthen those process skills needed for scientific inquiry. I have encountered many teachers who hold the same misconception that I held early in my career, that teaching through inquiry was dichotomous. Either a lesson was inquiry-based or it wasn't inquiry-based. And what emanates from that misconception is the notion that teachers may have to find new lesson plans if they want to promote student inquiry. And rather than having that understanding, we could conceptualize how current lesson plans can be tweaked and small, subtle ways to encourage students to practice inquiry skills. Lessons could be modified in specific, subtle ways to target particular purposes with respect to the inquiry skills. Lesson plans do not have to be modified to give students the opportunity to practice all of the inquiry skills all at once. Instead, lesson plans can incorporate small, subtle changes that target specific inquiry skills: asking questions, planning and conducting investigations, analyzing data, or communicating results. Those being the process skills of scientific inquiry. So with that, I'm going to share an example of a lesson plan. This is a one-page handout provided to students front and back. On the left side of the screen is the front page. The right side of the page represents the back page of this handout. And the lesson plan focuses on changes in matter, chemical changes, physical changes. This is most related to this Ohio 6th grade physical science standards, as well as the 9th grade physical science course with respect to changes in matter. This version of the lesson plan that I'm showing you right now has shifts already incorporated in it. So we're beginning with the new lesson plan that has been modified in very small, subtle ways. After we review this lesson plan, I'll share with you the original, and we'll identify how it was shifted and what possible benefits are to this shift. This lesson plan contains the following components. I will read them to you, and I apologize that the font and resolution may not be stellar today. There is a prompt that states, in this activity, you'll try to determine whether or not a chemical change has taken place by investigating the question, what indicates the occurrence of a chemical change? Careful observations will help you gather evidence. That is the prompt provided in this lesson plan. The lesson plan includes two parts. Part 1 states, read all of part 1, then design a data collection sheet on which you can record what you do and what you observe. Be sure that it is in a format that is easy to follow and can be shared with others. Then do the activity. The instructions for part 1 are as follows. Put on your safety equipment, place 1/4 teaspoon of sodium bicarbonate and 1/2 teaspoon of calcium chloride into a Ziploc bag. Fill a medicine cup with 5 milliliters of phenol red solution. Carefully place the cup in the bag, keeping it upright until after you zip the bag closed. Squeeze out as much air as possible and seal the bag. Keeping the bag sealed, tip the cup over, mix the chemicals together, and observe the result. Record what you did and what you observed on your data collection sheet. Record the evidence you think indicates a chemical change. That data collection sheet is the back side of this handout. That's part 1. Part 2, choose option A or option B below to continue your investigation. Design a new data collection sheet for that option. Complete the second option if time permits using another data collection sheet. Option A, predict what would happen if you tried the experiment again but left out one of the chemicals. Test your prediction. Record what you did and what you observed. Repeat this experiment, leaving out a different chemical. That's option A. Option B, predict what would happen if you varied the amount of one of the chemicals. Test your prediction. Record what you did and what you observed. Repeat this experiment several times, each time varying a different chemical. Okay, option A and option B are part 2 of this experiment. Lastly, there's a summary. Within the summary, students are informed to analyze and summarize the results of their experiments on the data collection sheet. List any questions you still have on your data collection sheets and describe what you have discovered about chemistry from this activity. This is a very traditional science lesson plan, most likely to be implemented at the middle school level. But again, this version of the lesson plan represents the lesson that has been tweaked, subtly shifted to promote more student inquiry. I'm going to walk you through this activity. It is designed to be performed in person with teachers. I have performed it on my own, and I'm going to share with you the results using still photos. Part 1, exploration. Okay, put on your safety equipment, place 1/4 teaspoon of sodium bicarbonate. That is baking soda. So I obtained 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda and 1/2 teaspoon of calcium chloride. That is de-icer, driveway de-icer, probably quite common today. We have very brutal winter weather here in Athens this week. So a lot of driveway de-icer being used this week, I'm quite sure. Phenol red is an acid-base indicator obtained through quite a few vendors. And I have these three materials shown here. Baking soda, a box of baking soda costs approximately $1. The driveway de-icer, calcium chloride, I checked, a large vendor had a 40-pound bag listed online for $7. And the phenol red solution through the vendor that I accessed was $10 for approximately 100 servings relative to this lesson plan. So that equates to about 10 cents per student group. Instead of medicine cups, I just use small serving cups, and the instructions say to fill the medicine cup with 5 milliliters of the phenol red solution. 5 milliliters is also equivalent to approximately 1 teaspoon. So I simply used a teaspoon, poured the phenol red into this small serving cup, added the calcium chloride and the baking soda to a Ziploc bag. I placed the phenol red solution in the Ziploc bag, sealed the bag, but I made sure that medicine cup was upright until the bag was sealed. Then I tipped it over, mixed the chemicals together, and made some observations. These photos show what I observed. Hopefully you can see some of the same observations that I was able to make in person. For part one, my observations were that there was a color change. The mixture of the chemicals turned yellow. None of the chemicals prior to mixing were yellow, so I observed a color change. There was foaming and bubbling. That also resulted in the bag expanding due to the foaming and the bubbling. And also the mixture felt hot. There was quite a bit of heat release. So those were my observations from part one. For part two, I chose option A. I repeated the experiment, but I left out the calcium chloride. I left out the de-icer. And when I mixed the chemicals together, there was no change observed. Nothing happened. I repeated again without the baking soda. There was a color change, but a different color change. The mixture turned purple instead of yellow. It still felt hot. That was an observation I made in part two. And also I observed foaming and bubbling. Those were my observations. Okay, so this was the shifted lesson plan. I know that was a quick overview of the activity, and I wish we could be together to perform this lesson in person with colleagues and discussion. Hopefully the photos did this justice. This was the shifted lesson plan. This was a new version of a science lesson that a teacher had tweaked. A reflection tool that teachers can use to gauge student inquiry that can help drive creative ideas for how you can tweak your lesson plans to promote student inquiry is part of this professional development workshop. And it's a very practical reflection tool I have shown here on the right side, which simply has a table in which you are to gauge teacher and learner responsibilities within the lesson plan. This reflection tool asks, who determines the question or the problem at hand? Is it the learner only? Is it the teacher only? Or is it some combination of teacher and learner, some shared degree of responsibility for determining the question or problem? Also, this reflection tool asks, who determines the procedure or the design? Who is planning the investigation, the design of the experiment or activity? Is it the learner only? Is it the teacher only? Or is it a shared responsibility, combination of teacher and learner? And then lastly, there is the question, who determines the results or the analysis? Do the students determine the results alone? Does the teacher make this determination, or is it a combination of shared responsibility? This reflection tool can help drive changes in lesson plans to promote more student inquiry. Before I share my responses to these questions relative to the lesson plan, I'm going to ask if you would be willing to do the same. On your screen, I am going to share this poll. Within this shifted activity that I just demonstrated, who do you think determines these components? Who determines the question or the problem? Who determines the procedure or the design of the activity? And who do you think determines the results and the analysis? I have the activity still shown on the screen. I hope it is not blocked too much from the interactive polling feature, but reflect on this notion of who has the responsibility for these different aspects of the lesson. Okay, I see about half of the attendees today have answered. Give you a few more moments to submit your responses. Again, your responses are anonymous. We cannot access who answered in what way. But please reflect on the lesson plan and offer your thoughts. Within this version of the lesson plan, who do you think has responsibility for these components of the lesson? Who was asking the question? Who is determining the design of the investigation? And who's determining the manner in which the results or the analysis are conveyed? Okay, I see just about everyone has answered. I'm going to go ahead and end the polling and share the results here. So we have a majority response for each of these is a combination of teacher and learner. Okay, I appreciate your responses. Again, those are anonymous, and I'm going to share my response. Within this version of the lesson, who determines the question or the problem? I answered teacher. I think the teacher is dictating, but my take is that this reflection tool really should be considered as a continuum without the discrete categories. I think lesson plans can actually vary within these categories rather than the three discrete columns shown here. I felt that the teacher was dictating the question at hand within the prompt, but I agree that there's a combination of shared responsibility for who determines the procedure. Students are allowed to choose what they do in part 2, and the way in which it's presented forces the students to think about how they would conduct the experiment. How would they repeat with leaving out some components? I felt that that was shared responsibility. And in terms of determining the results and the analysis, I said that that was shared responsibility. This version of the lesson plan has been shifted. Okay, and the reflection tool can allow us just to sit back and think about who has the responsibility for applying these process skills of doing science. Is it the student? Is it the teacher? Or is it a shared combination of learner and teacher? I now want to share with you a second version of this same lesson plan. This is referred to as the unshifted version. I am not going to demonstrate the lesson. It's the same activity. It's just a slightly different version. Within this version, as the unshifted example, we have a prompt that states that in this activity, you'll experiment with chemical reactions that take place in a Ziploc sandwich bag. The sealed bag prevents any chemicals from escaping before you have a chance to observe the reactions. Chemists gather evidence by observing. A chemical detective watches out for these 4 indicators, among others, of a chemical reaction: a change of color, change of temperature, formation of solids, and formations of gases. A good chemist must be careful to take the time to look for each of these kinds of evidence. Okay, that is the prompt within this version of the lesson. The procedure is stated. It's exactly the same as part one of the lesson I just overviewed and demonstrated. Then we have, questions. Write a detailed set of observations of the changes that you see. What evidence have you gathered that a chemical reaction has taken place? Question 3, predict what would happen if you left out the calcium chloride. Try the experiment again. Make careful observations of the changes you see and record them below. Predict what would happen if you left out the sodium bicarbonate. Try this and record your observations and results. Question 4, what happens when you use 1/4 teaspoon of sodium bicarbonate? What if you use 1 teaspoon of calcium chloride? Record everything that happens and the amount of each chemical added. And the last question in this version of the lesson plan, what have you discovered about chemistry from this experiment? Hopefully, you've identified a few subtle differences between the two versions of the lesson plan. I now want to show them side by side. The original unshifted version is on the left. The new version that has been shifted to incorporate some subtle changes is on the right. So again, the unshifted can be thought of as an original version. The shifted can be thought of as a new or tweaked version of the lesson plan. We have these two examples of the same lesson plans. I'm going to ask now, if you're willing, please post in the chat, what were some of the shifts you can identify between the original and the shifted version of this lesson plan? What are some of the shifts that you can identify? In just a moment, I'm going to ask, what are some possible benefits you might think of from those shifts? I'm going to pause and give you just a moment to share your thoughts. Identified shifts. Okay, as you're reflecting, I'm going to share some common examples of what teachers identify as shifts in the new version of the lesson plan. Common identified shifts that teachers have made in past sessions I've led is that the language of instruction is more open-ended. It's not tremendously different, but it's more open-ended. In the new version of the lesson, learners get to design their own data sheets. They're not told exactly what to look for or how to describe it. They're given more discretion in designing how they are reporting their results and observations. Learners get to choose some aspects of what they get to investigate. The learners are asked to report what they think is significant and not told what to look for that the teacher believes is significant. There's no assumption of a right answer. Students are told to make observations and explain what they think is significant. And there's an expectation that the learners will have new questions at the end of the activity when they're finished. Those are commonly identified shifts in this lesson plan. Some common benefits that teachers take note of that may emanate from these small subtle changes is that designing their own data sheets gives students a sense of freedom and also can help them to focus. Because students aren't told what to look for, they have to be more observant and interpret their results very carefully. Students have to use higher order thinking skills to interpret and analyze what they're seeing. They have to describe in detail what they're observing, then analyze and summarize what they did very carefully when they are given the discretion of designing their own data sheets. To explain their results, students have to write more than just brief notes. These are all teacher identified benefits of the shifts made in this lesson plan. In addition, students have ownership of what they do when they're given the discretion to choose what they do. Students are encouraged to make discoveries. It's empowering to make your own discoveries. Having choices can give students increased confidence and an increase in self-efficacy. Anticipating what results students might get can help keep them involved and engaged. These are all common teacher-identified benefits of the shifts made in this lesson plan. With respect to the reflection tool, I now want you to consider the original version, the unshifted version. This is not a bad lesson plan necessarily. There are not tremendous differences between the two versions of the lesson plan. But if we consider this original unshifted version, I'm going to ask that you provide the same interactive polling question for the unshifted version. If you would please share your thoughts on who has responsibility in the unshifted version. In the unshifted version, teacher, learner, or a combination of responsibility at the teacher and learner level for determining the question, determining the procedure, and determining how the results are analyzed and communicated. Okay, I see most of you are responding. I'm going to give you just a few more moments to share your thoughts on who has a responsibility for these components of science process skills, asking questions, designing the experiment, and analyzing and communicating the results. Okay, I'm going to give you just a few more seconds. Submit your responses if you are willing. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share the results. And we see a majority respond that the teacher has responsibility for determining the question, the teacher has responsibility for determining the procedure, and a combination of teacher and learner has a responsibility for determining how the results are analyzed and communicated. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that poll. Now going to share my thoughts, who I think has a responsibility. I generally agree. Determining the question or the problem, the teacher. The focus of the lesson is articulated by the teacher at the forefront within the prompt. In this activity, you'll experiment with chemical reactions. It's the question being investigated. Who determines a procedure or design? My interpretation of this version of the lesson is that the teacher has that responsibility. Students are not given any opportunity to deviate from the instructions within this lesson plan. They're told exactly what to do step by step. And in terms of determining the results or communicating, my interpretation is that the teacher also has that responsibility. There are 5 questions articulated, there's space provided, and students are told exactly how to fill out that space, answering the questions in very specified manners. These are not necessarily the correct answers within that reflection tool. I just wanted to share my interpretation and how I would categorize the responsibility at the learner and teacher level using this reflection tool. If we then compare the reflection tools, we see just a simple strategy at play. On the screen, on the left side represents the original unshifted version. On the right side represents the new shifted version. And if we apply those two reflection tools for each version of the lesson, we see that originally my take was that the teacher had all responsibility for dictating those process skills. The new version of the lesson allows a little more responsibility at the student level, not complete responsibility. I describe each of those two shifts as moving from teacher responsibility to shared responsibility. That is an example of the idea of a subtle shift in a lesson plan, giving students increased responsibility for practicing the process skills, not necessarily full responsibility of practicing all of the process skills. These are subtle shifts. Any shift in responsibility from teacher towards learner will give students more opportunity to practice and therefore develop inquiry skills. Any shift from teacher towards student will give students more opportunity to practice these skills. The shift does not have to be complete. It does not have to be in totality. Subtle shifts are possible. Subtle shifts are manageable. They could be very small tweaks in the lesson plan, but those tweaks, even if they are subtle, can still be very, very effective. And the idea, again, is to counter the misconception that teaching through inquiry is dichotomous. It's not an either or. It's not that a lesson plan is either full open-ended student inquiry or fully didactic at the teacher instruction. Instead, small subtle shifts are very beneficial to reflect on as educators. I want to show one more example of a lesson plan. I'm not going to demonstrate the activity. I don't have still photos to share, but this lesson plan and the changes that have been made through this workshop, the Exploratorium Institute for Inquiry, I feel this one really hammers home the notion of subtle shifts, very, very subtle shifts. This is a lesson plan centering on the behavior of light. This is most related to 5th grade physical science standard. Light and sound behave in predictable ways. This is a lesson plan centering on shadows and the relationship between light sources, objects, and shadows. This lesson plan has a procedure which utilizes a light bulb, an object, and a screen. And the idea is to observe aspects of a shadow that's generated on the screen. The procedure says, keep the light source in the same spot and move the object. Measure and record the size of the shadow with the object at the listed positions. And there's a table provided in this lesson plan. There is a prescribed distance from the light to the screen, distance from the light to the object, the size of the object being used in the lesson plan. And what students are to do is perform these 3 steps and record in the empty box the size of the shadow that results on the screen. This is part 1 to the procedure. Part 2 states to move the light source and keep the object in the same place. Measure and record the size of the shadow with the light source at the listed positions. Again, in part 2, there is a table with prescribed steps associated with it. Students follow these three trials in part 2, and they fill in the empty boxes of the table, the size of the shadow. And we have some summarizing questions that students answer. What patterns do you see in the size of the shadows? This is an example of an original unshifted lesson. Okay, I'm going to show it here on the screen, and I'm going to end today with an example of this lesson that has subtle shifts made to it. Very simple, very subtle changes. Here is the new version of the lesson plan. I'll give you just a moment, see if you can identify how this lesson plan has been shifted. If you look carefully, you'll notice, and now I'll put these up side by side. The original version is on the left, the new version is on the right. The only difference between the 2 versions is that the new shifted version allows students the discretion to choose, either in part 1, the distance from the light to the object. They get to choose that within the parameters set by the teacher. So the distance from the light to the screen is prescribed, 240 centimeters. The size of the object is set by the teacher, but the students have the discretion only to choose how far from the light to the object their trials employ. In part 2, we see the only difference is that students have a little more discretion. They can choose a distance from the light to the screen, as well as the distance from the light to the object. They can choose some parameters within their investigation. That's the only difference. Everything else in this version of the lesson is identical. I hope this example drives home the notion that subtle shifts in lesson plans are possible, but the potential benefit of those shifts can be profound. If we think of science inquiry as a set of processes, just looking at these two versions of the same lesson plan, we see that the shifted version allows students more opportunity to practice designing and conducting investigation. That is one of the science inquiry process skills that students are expected to develop through the course of their K-12 science education experience. That's a small, subtle change, but it gives students more opportunity to practice that one specific process skill. These are examples of lesson plans that have small, subtle changes in them. Hopefully, this has spurred some creative ideas you may have. And I want to reiterate, this is part of a developed workshop that's readily available online. There's a link in the chat to the facilitator's guide of this workshop. If this was of interest to you, you found it beneficial, I would encourage you to access this resource and consider sharing this with colleagues within your school building or your district. This workshop focuses on the three take-home messages I started with, but I'll reiterate these in closing. To help learners develop the abilities to do science, teachers need to give students the opportunity to practice doing science, practice asking questions, planning and conducting investigations, analyzing results, and communicating results to others. Teachers can make small, subtle shifts in their current lesson plans as opposed to looking for brand new lesson plans that promote student inquiry. Small, subtle shifts are possible. And teachers can modify their lessons in very specific, targeted ways to achieve particular purposes. The second lesson plan that I showed was an example of this. There was just a very minimal, small, subtle shift in that lesson plan that targeted only one of the four process skills, giving students more practice planning and conducting investigations. But that subtle shift was very targeted. It was also very well guided. The teacher still set parameters that the students had to work within. Those process skills as asking questions, planning and conducting experiments, analyzing data to draw conclusions, and communicating results to others, focusing on those process skills and how we can identify and implement small, subtle changes in lesson plans relative to those four skills is going to be the focus of our third and final webinar session within this webinar series. It's going to be a working session where we start with lesson plans. We collaborate with peers, other teachers who are able to join the session. We discuss small, subtle ways that you can give students more opportunity to practice asking questions, to practice planning and conducting experiments, to practice analyzing data to draw conclusions, and how we can give students subtle increases in ways to practice communicating results to others. I have some very concrete examples that I'll be sharing in session 3, but I also want to allow the webinar session to serve as a platform for you to share your ideas and collaborate with one another. And with that, hopefully this has been of interest and benefit to you. We have a few moments, and I want to open that up to any questions or comments you may have. As I said earlier, feel free to submit a question in the Q&A box of the webinar. But if I'm not able to address any of your questions, I would love the opportunity to correspond with you offline. Please feel free to email me. We can share ideas and correspond at any time. But I welcome your inquiries in the Q&A box as well. Or if anyone is willing to share a comment or a question aloud, please raise your hand in the Zoom feature, and we'll switch you over so you could turn on your mic and feel free to join the audio and share your question. And I see quite a few comments in the chat. Oh, I think I see one question just popped up. Do you suggest rubrics to assess student learning? Yes, rubrics certainly can be of benefit. It depends on the learning that's being assessed, and it depends on the rubric. From my experience, I have seen both very beneficial rubrics as well as not as beneficial rubrics. With respect to inquiry skills, the processes of inquiry, I do find this reflection tool to be quite helpful in engaging student inquiry at the teacher or lesson plan level, not necessarily at the student acquisition of skills level. But excellent question. I do think it's quite valuable to reflect on student achievement with respect to developing inquiry skills. I don't have a reflection tool to share in today's session. If I can find one, I would be glad to follow up with you and share that with you offline. Excellent question. We're about out of time. I see one more question, and we'll end with this for today. Thank you all for joining. The final question, pretty straightforward overall. Any suggestions for keeping an activity between the lines, but also allowing for increased inquiry? Yes, I do have suggestions. I did not, let's see, Rhonda. I did not pay Rhonda for that question, but that is an excellent segue into session 3. I will be offering suggestions. And actually, I feel that this framework does focus on keeping an activity between the lines, making sure that the teacher is still providing guidance, safety especially, but doing so in a manner that gives students increased opportunity to practice one or more of the process skills. In a subtle shifts approach, my advice is to consider ways to tweak lesson plans, process skill by process skill. Just pick one of the process skills that you want a lesson plan to give students more opportunity to practice that skill and to develop, such as asking questions. Take a lesson plan, consider ways to tweak so that students have more opportunity to practice researchable scientific questions. It can become less manageable if, as educators, we take the approach of changing the entire lesson plan to try to give students more opportunity to practice all of the process skills all at once. That can become less manageable. It can be effective. It is doable, but really goes beyond the notion of a subtle shift. So in session 3, Rhonda, I greatly appreciate the question and the segue. Yes, I do have suggestions. I apologize that we're out of time today, but I'm very eager and enthusiastic to meet with you again for session 3. And I'll offer those suggestions. I'll welcome suggestions from collaborating teachers who are able to join us as well. And then we'll put those suggestions into practice. We'll take some lesson plans, apply our own ideas for subtle shifts, and we'll see how we can apply this strategy and the framework of thinking about student inquiry in this manner. We are out of time. I want to be very respectful of what all of you are doing this year, in particular, the hurdles and challenges you're dealing with in your schools and your classrooms cannot be overstated. And I want to be very respectful of your time. I appreciate your ability to join us for today's session. And I apologize if I was not able to address any of the other questions you submitted. I do have record of those. I'm going to try to follow up with each of you by email, but I welcome any other correspondence. If attendees have questions or comments, please feel free to reach out, and we'll correspond offline. And with that, I thank you so much for your time today. And my email is shown here. Please feel free to follow up. And I hope you're able to attend the third and final session of the webinar series. Each of the sessions will be recorded, posted publicly. We'll share links to the sessions. And thank you for all that you do. Have a great day.